Well, in recent years, we have seen both Kentucky and North Carolina go on deep NCAA tournament runs despite lower seeds. After both losing on Tuesday, does either program have a chance to do so this year?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome to the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, and this episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. All right, it is Wednesday. Thrilled to be joined here today by Leif Thulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board and, of course, regular guest here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Leif, we saw North Carolina fall to Wake Forest on Tuesday evening on the road. We saw Kentucky lose at Rupp Arena to a good but unranked Arkansas team. It's two blue bloods who are now, quite honestly, inching closer and closer to not even being in the field of 68. However, we have seen both these programs do this before. We saw Hubert Davis in North Carolina do it last year, so I kind of want to start with them. This is a team that's now lost 3 games in a row. They're obviously having some issues figuring out how to put some of their pieces together, but again, Davis and co. did this last year, got an 8 seed, went all the way to the NCAA championship, lost to Kansas. Looking at this team this year, the pieces that they have, the current stretch of games that they've played, is that a situation that you think is at all feasible for this team, or are you kind of starting to feel like, I'm not even sure if this team's going to be able to make a run at all this year?
Yeah, I think I'm somewhere in between those two alternatives. I do think they'll fight and claw their way into the tournament. Mm-hmm. I don't think they have the horsepower, despite having a similar lineup to what they had when they made the run, make a deep run. Despite this year, I feel like being more wide open. The issue is they seem to lack chemistry. Yeah. And that's something you really expected them to have a surplus of, considering 4 of the 5 starters have started multiple years and started a national championship game. The backcourt has had this my turn, your turn dynamic, and it's become, I don't want to say contentious, but I can't imagine that it's easy to play alongside of for some of the players. Pete Nance was a heralded transfer who many people thought in a vacuum was a better player than Brady Manick, just wasn't quite as good a fit. And I think he struggled wearing Carolina blue so far. And there's a lot of kind of blame being tossed around. I'm not saying by the program internally, but just you watch a broadcast of Carolina and everyone's got different perspectives of what's been wrong. And there hasn't been too many perspectives of what's been right. And that concerns me. That said, they're a veteran bunch and they have this almost bravado that, like, I spoke about this with a friend of mine the other day about like the Champions League soccer, like a team like Real Madrid. If they're not playing well, you fear them. Yeah, I think that's the same thing with Carolina and some of these blue bloods, that they just expect to win, and I think that's something that really benefits a team come March Madness. Even if they're an 8 seed and they're playing the number 1 Baylor like they did last year, I don't think for a moment Carolina didn't think, hey, we're not expected to win, and they put that forth. So I think there is trouble in Chapel Hill, but I think there's a recipe to get into the tournament. I just don't think they're a championship contender.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think if I was a 1 seed or a 2 seed and I was facing number 8, 9, or 7 Carolina or whatever in the NCAA tournament, like, you're not treating that the same way that you might treat an opportunity to play like a 9-seeded, Seton Hall, who sneaks into the tournament and gets the seat like that. Like it's a different feeling. It's a different vibe because they're the number 1 team in the country to start the season. And certainly they haven't lived up to those expectations, but still a really dangerous team. I'm curious, before we switch to Kentucky, I'm curious on the North Carolina train, like with the backcourt kind of dysfunction, for lack of a better word, and the fact that these guys have played together and it's not like a new group that you're trying to put the pieces together. How much of that do you attribute to maybe a younger coach or a less experienced coach in Hubert Davis? Like, do you think that that's an issue that he needs to be able to address, or is it just like these are just personalities that are making it a little bit tricky for this team to gel the way that maybe a lot of people thought they would?
I think it's certainly both. I think both those guards are big-time players individually, and they can be as a duo. That said, I think managing the egos is something that coaches get better at with age.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Hubert kind of caught lightning in a bottle of a program that was built by Roy, a team that had tempered expectations, but still the hunger and the knowledge of how to win that's instilled through the program. Had a good transfer to lead them, and Brady Manick can be a kind of a maturity, a sounding board. But I would lean towards the coach, but also it's individuals. There's a lot of teams that can sacrifice and have a player take a lesser role for a player to take a larger role. It seems like these two have alternated games at even halves, and really have not found a way to coalesce and create a impressive offense for a team that should be able to score really, really well. They scored 25 in the first half yesterday and 60 in the second half. And it was okay, why is there such a disparity between these two halves? Is the desperation that lacking in the first half that you're so desperate to score, and it's a little bit of garbage time scoring, but still 60 points. That's more than they would have scored if you combine their first two first halves. So I don't know. I think it's mostly coaching. I lean towards coaching, but I think there's something to be said for the players not kind of bargaining from their movement, so to speak, of okay, well, I'm supposed to score 15 a game. I'm supposed to score 17 a game. And if they're not at that, I feel like they start chucking the ball a little too often.
Well, let's switch over to Kentucky. Kentucky obviously lost a home game to Arkansas. It's probably not as bad of a loss as Wake Forest, just in the sense that Arkansas is a better team, a team that's been ranked for huge chunks of the season, that obviously has dealt with pretty significant injuries on their squad that's kind of hampered their expectations this season, but still a really solid squad. What I saw in this Kentucky-Arkansas game was a pretty well played, a pretty balanced first half. And then both teams went into halftime. Both teams made adjustments, or at least should have made adjustments. Eric Musselman and the Razorbacks came out and just went on a really monstrous run. I think Calipari called a timeout less than 90 seconds into the second half. And it kind of never really got closer than that. And we've talked on this podcast a handful of times about Coach Calipari and some of the decisions that he has made as a coach this year and how it has hampered and held back this Kentucky roster in some ways. Kentucky's looking at a team right now. They got one really big game left. They're playing Tennessee on the 18th. That's a huge chance for a marquee win for Cal, a really needed win, but the rest of their schedule is not great, and they're kind of right on the bubble. So, I mean, forget talking about going on a run. First of all, do you think this team's even going to be able to find themselves in the big dance come March?
I do think they'll make the big dance. I actually didn't have too many issues watching Kentucky yesterday. I thought they played pretty well. Arkansas just played very well. They shot 63% from the field. And so, yes, you can say Kentucky can play better defense than they could. But that first half in particular, I thought Kentucky was playing some of their better basketball of the year. And so that doesn't mean that this is a Kentucky team that you dread, you dread facing. But I do think that this team will make the tournament. And I think this is more of a statement of how good Arkansas is if they can hit shots. They only shot 9 threes, which sometimes they get baited into shooting a lot. So they went 4 of 9, which is significantly better than they shoot. They shoot terribly most of the time. They're able to crack the paint and get good shots. Anthony Black was really good. And then I thought Case and Wallace was pretty awesome. So from a draft perspective, I was watching that game and I was like, man, if those two can play like that, these teams are significantly different. Their ceilings are super high. And so I do think Kentucky gets in. I think they're playing better basketball right now than North Carolina. The question is, you mentioned it, they don't play that many good teams left. They've already beaten Tennessee, so do they need to beat them twice to get a significant win? Do they need to perform well in the SEC tournament to really secure their standing as a team on the right side of the bubble, as an at-large bid? And then the other question would be, if you're to compare North Carolina and Kentucky, which team do you trust more, the team with veterans or the team that's starting to coalesce? And I would typically say veterans. That said, I think Kentucky's playing better basketball right now against better competition. So I think they'd finish the year well against somewhat inferior. Now they're 7-4 in conference play. So I do like their chances to get in the tournament.
The next 4 games for Kentucky: at Georgia, at Mississippi State. They got the big home game against Tennessee, and then they got a road trip to Florida. It's tough because those are 3, road games in the SEC. Never easy necessarily, but feels to me like they probably don't have to win all 4, but they got to probably win 3. And if they lose to Tennessee, they really have to win the rest of those games there, I think. And yeah, it's tough because you're not necessarily getting opportunities to pick up big wins, but you got games that aren't necessarily going to be super easy to win, but you kind of have to if you want a chance of making the big dance. All right, Leaf, we saw Indiana defeat Rutgers on Tuesday, which means 8 teams are within one game of each other in the Big Ten standings. Is anybody going to step out of that group? We're going to talk about that in the second segment. But first, today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. The Super Bowl is here, and we are so excited about our new sports betting partner for Locked On because they're the #1 sportsbook in America, FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, that is even better. They have so many great features that make sports betting fun and easy. New customers can join today to get started with $150 in free bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just sign up at FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel has all your favorite bets from the money line to the point spreads to player props. Plus, you can even combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. We'll have a few upset picks for you later in the show. Take them or leave them, but either way, you can bet comfortably on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So basketball fans, don't miss out. Place your first $5 bet to get $150 in free bets, win or lose, at FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL. All right, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball, still here chatting with Leaf Tulane of the Locked On NBA Big Board. Leaf, I want to switch over to talk about the Big Ten a little bit. Tuesday night, obviously, we saw a big victory for the Hoosiers of Indiana, picked up a nice win over Rutgers. They are now 8-5 in league play. And before we talk about the Big Ten and the standings and basically who is going to be behind Purdue when the season finalizes, I want to talk a little bit about Trayce Jackson-Davis because he had another monstrous performance against Rutgers. We talked about Indiana last week, and it was kind of a, hey, is anybody going to step up and help TJD? And we've seen some guys kind of do so, and we saw some nice performances this last week. But we've also seen Trayce Jackson-Davis on a just historic run. He crossed 2,000 points at Indiana. He's averaging more points, more rebounds, more assists, and more blocks than he has throughout his career. Really, really nice season from TJD. What have you seen from him this year?
I think there's an air of maturity around him where he always had the physical capacity to dominate a game, and he showed flashes of it. But I think he's doing it from an intellectual perspective and put it together that he knows the spots that really help his team. Not only does he score the ball and rebound the ball, those were givens. It's almost like Oscar Sheba. You could, when he plays enough minutes, he's going to get a double-double.
Yep.
It's the same idea. But he's put himself in situations where he's on the block and he can kick out and start the rotations that have made Indiana better. Defensively, he's anchored their defense and really become a very good rim protector. And I've also seen him just be a person who brings reason to their team. There's been times where Purdue made a storm and they didn't even call a timeout. It was just Trayce Jackson-Davis kind of said, let's slow it up. And then he went and got a bucket, and that really righted the ship. So I think what's made Indiana better is their team's better. They've stuck together. They have a dynamic playmaker in the backcourt in Jalen Hood-Schifino. His consistency is a question, but the consistency of Trayce Jackson-Davis and the maturity, the leadership is really what has propelled Indiana up the Big Ten standings from a team that was talented but not playing well. And then they almost had an addition by subtraction. Xavier Johnson, I felt like, took the ball away from TJD, and then through playing through TJD has allowed for guys like Miller Kopp, like Galloway, and Race Thompson coming back in. He's also a veteran. I think they've all benefited from the presence of the man in the interior. And then Trayce Jackson-Davis, it's a symbiotic relationship. He benefits from when they hit shots because he's got less bodies to work through in the rugged Big Ten post battles. So, he's going to be an All-American at this rate. And the question is, how good can Indiana be? And I think that really relies on how well they can shoot the three consistently. And if TJD continues to play this well, they should be able to shoot the three okay because he's drawing a ton of attention.
Let's talk about the Big Ten a little bit, and let's talk about kind of Indiana's place there. Purdue's got a 3-game lead over everybody. I don't think that anybody's catching Purdue unless they have a historic meltdown. But after that, it gets really jumbled. Indiana and Rutgers are now tied for second place thanks to Indiana's victory on Tuesday night. They're 3 games back. Iowa, Northwestern, Michigan, and Illinois are all a half game back from Indiana and Rutgers. And then Michigan State and Maryland are a half game back on that. So basically everybody's within 1 game of each other outside of the few bottom feeders towards the end of the conference there. I don't think anybody's catching Purdue, like we said. I don't think we even have to discuss that. But do you think there's going to be anybody else in this group who's going to get any separation, or is there a team that stands out to you as like, yeah, that's definitely the second best team. They just don't quite have the record yet?
I'd say the second and third best teams are Indiana and Illinois. I think there's a pretty clear-cut delineation that no matter where they match up, they have the talent to win. I mean, that includes against Purdue. Purdue's the favorite in those matchups, but I think they've got the talent. Indiana's playing the best right now outside of Purdue, but I think it's just hard to be so reliant on one player and then a freshman as their number two. So I wouldn't put them as a definitive number two. I've said this before. Maybe this is just me sticking with my old ways, but I thought Illinois was the most talented team on paper coming into the season. I just watched them play Iowa at Iowa, and I thought Illinois was the better team, even though they lost by 2 in that game. And I would say it's Purdue, Indiana, Illinois. Take your pick at 2 and 3 there. And then for 4, I struggle to continue giving it to Rutgers. Rutgers has this way of winning at home. They really like squeeze the sponge dry, and you're sitting there and you're like, okay, can we score, and how many can they score? So a team like Iowa is going to beat Rutgers. In fact, they have beaten them twice because they just score prolifically, and then the offense in that case is going to beat the defense because the offense is lagging so far behind for Rutgers. Not to mention they lost Mawot Mogg for the season to a torn ACL. So I would say that Iowa will finish top 4. That said, I think that you can make a strong case for Iowa, Michigan State, and Michigan. Maryland has played very well, but they haven't played terribly good competition, and a lot of their games recently have been at home and for their surge up the standings. So I would say Purdue, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa would be my top 4. That said, Iowa has flaws. We've seen this year in, year out. They score really well. But I think this year they're fairly balanced, and they're going to be able to score, protect their home court, maybe sneak a few road wins. And that's the thing. Other than Purdue, no team at Northwestern actually does have a positive away record, but I don't know how much of it is in conference. Like Indiana's 3-5 away. Rutgers is 2-5 away. Illinois is 3-3. Northwestern's 5-2. Iowa's 2-4. Maryland 2-6. Michigan State 2-6. Like, you're not going to win on the road, so it's just protecting home court. And those are the teams I think will do so best and be able to maybe sneak a few on the road, which is that's what wins you the conferences. And you're not going to catch Purdue, but that's what's going to get you second in the conferences. Who can win the most road games?
Well, the Big Ten's struggles in the NCAA tournament have been well documented over recent years. Lenardi's recent bracket at ESPN has 8 teams from the Big Ten in the Big Dance. Again, kind of taking Purdue out of it because they're going to get a higher seed. Certainly, they are not impervious to getting upset early. That could very well happen to them. But among the other, if the Big Ten does have a good year conference-wise in the NCAA tournament, if they finally kind of turn the tide, what teams, and you maybe already mentioned them a little bit there, like what teams do you think have the best chance to make it to a Sweet 16, make it to Elite 8, really kind of help change that reputation for the Big Ten?
Yeah, this becomes an interesting question because it depends where they're seated. And I think they beat up on each other so much that none of these teams are going to be extremely well seated. So outside of Purdue, that is. So I think Purdue is the most obvious candidate. I would say Indiana is the second most likely candidate just because I think their seed line will be beneficial. I think if they get, a 5 seed, that there's a legitimate possibility you get to the Sweet 16. I think Illinois has the potential to be very dangerous because they switch a lot of screens. They have multiple scores. I don't love their guard play, especially with Sky Clark leaving the team. I think he was a true point guard. Young, made mistakes, but at least he was unselfish in that regard. I think they're kind of patchwork in the backcourt right now, but that's a tough team to match up with. And I think a team like Michigan State will be an 8 seed. So it's always hard to pick like an 8-1 upset. But I'm telling you, no 1 seed wants to face Tom Izzo. No. I can promise you that. And then I think Michigan will end up in a similar spot to where they were last year as a 10 or 11. And despite being the underdog, so to speak, in round 1, the 10 and 11 is a good spot to make a dent into the tournament just because they've got the offensive talent, and I believe defensively they can coalesce and become better. Like, for instance, their worst defender in their starting lineup is Jet Howard, who's their best prospect. And I just believe that in games that you must win, that those type of players can turn it on. So those are the teams I kind of foresee making a dent in madness. That said, I think the battle of attrition that is the Big Ten Conference really hurts them in the tournament. I think this has been the case. They typically play a similar style. And so when teams play a different style and these teams are all beat up and they're lower seeds than they would be if they played in different conferences, it actually hurts them. The Big 12 is going to have the lower seeds for all these awesome teams. But I think because they play different styles, I would say Baylor plays an entirely different style than that of a team like Kansas State.
Right.
Or I guess they play quickly because they both play quickly, but you get my point that they have different personnel types.
Sure.
That helps the Big 12, and that's why they're able to make big tournament runs despite a significant battle of attrition in their conference standings.
Well, we got Upset Watch coming up next, Leaf. Very excited to have opportunity to look at a few upsets coming up this weekend. It felt to me like there wasn't a lot of great picks this week, and perhaps that's just because the nature of how the schedule kind of laid out a lot of teams that maybe could get upset by the team they're playing, but they're playing at home, and it's hard to pick them to lose at home. So I'm going to start with the first upset that I have on my rankings. And it's technically the way that we have typically done Upset Watch in the past, for those who are new to the show listening, is we pick a unranked team to beat a ranked team. So in this situation, I'm picking an upset that is actually not an upset by FanDuel Sportsbook right now. This game is happening on Wednesday evening. Utah State taking on number 25 ranked San Diego State, a Mountain West battle right there. Currently, according to the FanDuel odds, Utah State is favored by 1.5 points because they are at home. The Aggies are 11-1 at home on the season. They have not lost there very much this year. As a team, they're shooting 42% from deep. The issues for Utah State are on the defensive end of the floor. I think they're outside of the top 125 in KenPom defensively. Meanwhile, San Diego State is a top 50 team, both offensively and defensively. So a little bit less of a balance there specifically, but for me, Utah State has continually impressed me as one of the better teams in the Mountain West, a team that I'm not sure has quite gotten as much respect nationally as perhaps they deserve. A win over a ranked team in San Diego State, even if they are the favored team, would turn the tides a little bit in the Mountain West, kind of maybe bring them back into that bubble conversation that they've kind of been floating around throughout the regular season. So again, depending on your definition of an upset, this game maybe doesn't qualify, but for me, I think there's a good chance that San Diego State falls on the road to Utah State and the Aggies pick up a nice win there.
Yeah, that's one I had as well. I think that's a good chance for a team that's really good offensively. I had a couple Big Ten ones. One of them is a kind of bottom dwellers facing off. I've got Nebraska beating Wisconsin. At Nebraska. So that one's just a bottom dweller one. But here's a ranked one. I've got Illinois beating Rutgers.
Okay,
and I'd imagine that'll be close to a pick 'em, maybe even Illinois favored. That's a little bit down the road. Like I mentioned, I think they're the more talented team, but also Rutgers is a little bit hurt. And that's a team like in Illinois that can score. And I think the teams that can score do better against a team like Rutgers. So I think that's a pretty decent one. And then back to you.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one as well. I think Illinois is definitely a team that Rutgers, especially with the injuries that they've been having lately, and like you mentioned, the teams that score a lot of points tend to do good against them. So that'll be an interesting matchup there. The next one I have, staying on the West Coast for me, going over to Saturday, 7 p.m. on ESPN, February 11th, Oregon hosting UCLA, top 10 team in the Bruins. Oregon is fighting for their lives right now. They are still kind of in that bubble conversation. The latest from Lenardi had them as a first four out. They've had some big wins. They had the win over Arizona. That really has helped their resume quite a bit. That was also at home for them. They've also had some pretty ugly losses, scored 41 points against Colorado in a game recently, lost to Stanford not that long ago. So a team that has kind of had as many Pac-12 teams tend to do, has a kind of mystifying resume with some big wins and some horrendous losses. So for Oregon, like, they got USC on Thursday, they got UCLA on Saturday. They cannot lose both of them. Even losing one of them is tough. It's tough. If they can beat UCLA, and I see some matchup reasons why it could happen, Oregon has finally gotten healthy. That's the biggest story for them right now. Keyshawn Bartholomew is back. He's been missed most of the year with an injury, transfer out of Colorado, really, really talented point guard for them. And then Jermaine Couisnard was hurt for a huge chunk of the season. He came back. He dropped 27 points in that win over Arizona, had a monstrous performance there. He's a South Carolina transfer as well. So Dana Altman finally getting kind of the pieces all lined up together here. I think UCLA is the more talented team. I don't think that's particularly debatable, but I think that Oregon has some horses. N'Faly Dante, very, very good post player for them. If Will Richardson can play some consistent basketball, which has not been the case really for him this year, but if he comes out, if he plays well, if he can help neutralize Tiger Campbell a little bit on the other end, I think there's an opportunity for Oregon at Matt Knight Arena in Eugene on Saturday to pull off a really, really big victory for them, potentially knock UCLA down a seed, and put Oregon back in the driver's seat for a spot in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, I think the bubble is such a motivator for some of these teams. And Oregon's one where their talent is far superior to with the product that's been on the floor. Sure. But now the talent's catching up with some of those players coming back. I've got two more that I'm not fully confident in, but I think talent has a way of seeping through, and that's another one. Michigan, squarely on the bubble right now.
Yep.
I could see them beating Indiana in the Chrysler Center, playing at home. They've got a big to neutralize or at least match or try to match what TJD does. We talked about how awesome he's been. Hunter Dickinson hasn't been too shabby himself. They've got the offensive talent. Defensively, I think they're starting to play a bit better. You saw that display against Ohio State recently. They can defend home court. And one more, this one I'm not as confident in, but I got to say the Big 12 is pretty difficult to win on the road. Going to Morgantown, West Virginia is not a friendly place. Iowa State's significantly better at home. So they travel to West Virginia, and I think West Virginia could give Iowa State a shot for their money. West Virginia is really starting to pick it up. Bob Huggins has found his personnel and how to play with that personnel. Eric Stevenson's been really impressive. Curious to see how they score against a really staunch Iowa State defense. But playing at home and playing with confidence is always a good thing for West Virginia. So those are the ones that I can see as feasible upsets. And hopefully we replicate last week where I think that between us we went 5 for 5.
5 for 5, and that included the number 1 team in the country going down. We had Indiana beating Purdue, and then that one came together. So
and number 2 Tennessee. I said it off air to Andy, but he can verify this is a true sentiment.
True. That is true. Absolutely. Yeah. Leaf, thank you so much. Always appreciate your insight. Always appreciate having you on the show. Fantastic as always. Looking forward to another really, really exciting week of college basketball. Next week, perhaps we'll have a little bit more separation in the Big Ten to chat about. But again, thanks for coming on the show.
Of course. It's a pleasure.